It was a quiet, late night at Xyrus Academy. The moon hung high, casting a pale glow over the campus. Hidden in the shadows, two students moved stealthily near one of the school buildings. With mischievous grins on their faces, they painted graffiti on the walls in thick crimson red. The message they were leaving behind was filled with hatred. Elves, dwarves, get out. Their fun, however, came to a sudden halt. Without warning, Arthur had appeared between the two of them, his calm but sharp eyes staring directly at their crime. His tone was casual as he asked if he could join in on their little fun. The boy immediately panicked, his body stiffening before bolting away in fear. Shouting in terror, the girl, caught off guard and unable to escape, clenched her jaw and gathered water mana between her hands, preparing to attack. She yelled at Arthur to stay back, but Arthur didn't flinch. With a swift move, he extended his leg and tripped her effortlessly, sending her crashing to the ground. Even as she hit the floor, the girl barked at him, accusing him of having no manners and asking how he could hit a girl. Arthur remained calm, replying that he believed in gender equality. He didn't see a reason to treat her differently. As he raised his hand, wind mana began to swirl in his palm, quietly threatening. He then gave her a choice: test him, or cooperate and be escorted to the administration office. Before the situation could escalate further, Theodore appeared from behind, firmly holding on to the fleeing boy. He informed Arthur that there were no symbols on the boy's back, markings that could have identified him as part of a deeper group. At the same time, Sylvie, hidden from sight, used her senses to inspect the girl. Her voice rang clearly in Arthur's mind. There were no symbols on her either. Arthur passed this information to Theodore. Both students were clean. Theodore gave a frustrated sigh, saying he would take the two back himself. He then asked Arthur if he would be alright staying there alone. Arthur nodded calmly and assured Theodore that he would be fine. The night continued, and a short while later, Arthur walked along the academy halls with Sylvie. She began to squirm slightly, her emotions bubbling up as she grew restless. She was hungry, bored, and sleepy, all at once. Arthur offered some comfort, saying they were almost done with their rounds for the night and promised to grab something to eat afterward. The promise lit up Sylvie's mood, and she nodded excitedly. As they moved ahead, Arthur silently noted that they were getting close to Kai's patrol area. He considered turning back to avoid crossing paths. But before he could decide, Sylvie suddenly stiffened in his arms. Her instincts flared, and she alerted Arthur with a pulse of panic. She sensed strange mana nearby. Reacting instantly, Arthur held Sylvie close and slipped behind a thick pillar. His eyes scanned the area as footsteps echoed faintly through the corridor. A hooded figure came into view, moving quickly and cautiously. Arthur's gaze narrowed when he spotted a familiar marking on the figure's back, the same symbol that had been seen earlier on Marcos. Suspicion flared in Arthur's mind. Something wasn't right. He stayed hidden and watched carefully as the figure slowed down and began heading into one of the corridors. Arthur quietly shifted his position, climbing higher to get a better vantage point from the rooftop. Sylvie's voice rang in his thoughts again, urging him to follow. The figure in the brown robe had gone that way, but Arthur remained calm, telling her to wait. If they followed too closely, the stranger might sense their presence. If this person really was part of something larger, it was better to let him lead them to wherever he was going, perhaps even the hideout. As Arthur focused on trailing silently from above, a voice called out his name from behind. The sound pierced the silence. He froze, heart sinking. The hooded figure below stopped and turned back in alarm. Arthur spun around and found Kai approaching him, casual and unaware of the situation. Arthur raised his hand urgently, motioning Kai to stay quiet, but it was already too late. By the time Arthur turned back, the hooded stranger had vanished, completely gone, as if into thin air. Frustration boiled within him. He had been so close. That could have been their lead, possibly someone directly tied to Marcos. Kai, confused and trying to understand, began to question what Arthur was doing in his patrol zone, but Arthur cut him off sharply. He explained that he had been following someone suspicious, someone who might have revealed the location of a larger group. If only Kai hadn't interrupted, they might have finally gotten a breakthrough. Kai didn't hold back his frustration. He reminded Arthur that, regardless of the situation, he should have reported the suspicious figure the moment the chase entered Kai's patrol zone. It was protocol. Then, Kai asked about Theodore. Arthur explained that they had caught two students defacing the academy walls with graffiti. Theodore had taken them to the administration office while Arthur stayed behind to finish the patrol. Kai's concern grew sharper. He pointed out that this meant no one was currently watching Arthur's patrol zone. Before the conversation could continue, both of their eyes caught a sudden glow, sharp and unmistakable. The metal knives attached to their uniforms lit up bright yellow. That glow wasn't random, it was a signal. Theodore had activated his emergency dagger. Arthur's jaw clenched and frustration surged through him. Something had gone wrong. Kai, staying composed, placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. Since it was his zone, Kai volunteered to continue the search for the hooded figure. He told Arthur to go check on his partner without delay. Arthur nodded and turned to leave, but before rushing off, he gave Kai one last detail. His target had been wearing a brown hooded robe, dark slacks, and long boots. Kai acknowledged the description, ready to follow up. Arthur didn't waste another second. He sprinted through the corridors, cutting corners and leaping downstairs, his heart pounding. The quiet halls felt colder now. When he finally found Theodore, the sight ahead made his pace slow. Theodore was surrounded surrounded by other disciplinary committee members. He was sitting upright but clearly shaken. Arthur rushed toward him and demanded to know what had happened. Before Theodore could answer, Doradrea cut in with a sarcastic remark. According to her, Theodore had been knocked out by a hit to the back of the head, but Theodore insisted it wasn't just a casual blow. The strike had been far too strong. If it were just a normal hit, he wouldn't have blacked out. It had to be from an experienced augmenter, someone skilled and powerful. Doradrea rolled her eyes, but Arthur could sense the truth in Theodore's voice. Curtis explained how Theodore had been ambushed while escorting the two students to the administration building. By the time the rest of the committee arrived, both students were already gone. Still, Curtis remained confident. Since they were enrolled students, it would only be a matter of time before they were found again. Arthur considered the situation and wondered if the two delinquents had received help, maybe from a friend, someone who had been waiting for the right moment. Theodore, still rubbing the back of his head, dismissed the idea of it being a regular student. No average student could knock him out with a single strike. Whoever it was had to be older, stronger, or something else entirely. Arthur picked up the thought and completed it aloud. It could have been someone like Marcos. Theodore agreed. The attacker's strength didn't match that of any normal student. Curtis asked if Theodore had seen anything, any detail at all. Theodore recalled that he might have managed to graze the attacker with his weapon before losing consciousness, but he admitted he had no visual. Everything had happened too fast. Arthur, hearing this, silently thought about the strange injury he had noticed earlier. When Kai had approached him, wasn't there a wound on his arm? He asked Sylvie in his mind. Sylvie responded with uncertainty, but she believed there had been something. Just then, Theodore questioned why Arthur had been coming from Kai's patrol area. Arthur paused. He decided not to mention the hooded figure. Revealing it now wouldn't help, especially when Theodore was already upset and injured. So Arthur replied vaguely, brushing it off as nothing important. But his avoidance didn't go unnoticed. The rest of the group exchanged subtle glances, their expressions curious. Trying to shift the mood, Theodore defended Kai's reputation. Despite what people thought, Kai could handle himself in tough situations. Doradrea agreed, adding that even though he looked sneaky, he was a dependable person, especially for a human. Curtis immediately jumped on that remark, teasing her for being unintentionally racist. Doradrea panicked and tried to explain herself. Curtis only grinned and jokingly called for her to be cuffed on the spot. A lighthearted banter followed, easing the tension that had built up through the night. The group slowly began to disperse, the incident leaving behind questions, but no immediate answers. By the next morning, Arthur found himself sitting in Gideon's class. Though the lecture moved on as usual, Arthur's mind was elsewhere, still circling around the events from the night before. Arthur sat in class, his thoughts drifting restlessly. Despite all efforts, they still hadn't found the person who attacked Theodore. Worse, Kai hadn't been able to locate the hooded figure either. The memory of Kai yelling his name so loudly that night kept nagging at him. Was he just overthinking? Theodore had said to trust Kai, but the timing of Kai's appearance and that injury on his arm, something about it felt off. While Arthur was lost in thought, a presence loomed behind him. Professor Gideon had been watching closely, and without warning, he spoke up. Arthur nearly jumped out of his seat, startled by the sudden voice. He scrambled to cover up the mess on his desk. Gideon looked disappointed. He had assumed Arthur was working on something new and brilliant, but all he saw was a disorganized pile of components. Just then, Emily noticed Arthur's distracted expression and asked if something was bothering him. Arthur brushed it off with a simple excuse, saying he was just tired from the disciplinary committee's duties. Still, his mind remained unfocused. He realized he could barely remember what had happened during his earlier classes. Emily leaned over and nudged him with her elbow, breaking his daze. With a wink, she quietly passed him a set of light-producing artifacts, something Arthur had been waiting for. His mood lifted immediately. Emily's timing was perfect, and he couldn't help but smile in gratitude. Later that day, Arthur headed to Professor Glory's class. It was time for practical training. The field was active with students in motion, and Glory's voice rang out sharply across the area. She commanded the augmenters to stay in formation and reminded them to coordinate with the conjurers. She stressed discipline and teamwork, making sure no one got carried away chasing opponents. Once the class ended, Arthur found a quiet spot beneath a tree to rest. The shade offered relief, but his thoughts wandered again. He couldn't believe that despite everything Lucas had done in connection with Marcos, the only punishment he received was a short suspension. It felt unjust. Sylvie's voice nudged his attention back. She noticed Tessia wasn't around. Arthur assured her they'd see Tessia later that evening during training, reminding her to be patient. Sylvie perked up at the thought, especially because they had no patrol duty that night. When Arthur asked if she disliked it that much, she didn't deny it. As the afternoon sun softened, Professor Glory approached. She looked tired, and without a word, she sat down beside Arthur. He immediately sensed something was bothering her and asked if everything was all right. Glory shared her frustration. The council had restricted access to nearly all the dungeons she normally used for training. The Lances were conducting an investigation, and for now, excursions were on hold. Arthur asked if that meant there wouldn't be a trip this semester. Glory clarified that there would still be one, but it would be a lower tier dungeon, not nearly as challenging as usual. She gave a soft laugh and warned Arthur not to blame her if the upcoming dungeon turned out to be too easy for him. Later that day, Arthur trained with Tessia inside the Academy's training room. The session had been intense, filled with focused movements and bursts of mana. As their breathing slowed, Arthur decided to end the session, seeing that Tessia was already quite exhausted. She gave him a thankful look, her breaths heavy and shoulders rising with fatigue. Arthur noticed the pool at the edge of the room and gestured toward it, suggesting they cool off. The two of them sat down beside the water, dipping their feet into the pool. The chill was refreshing against their tired legs, and for a moment, everything around them slowed down. Arthur turned to Tessia, asking how she had been feeling lately, specifically if she was still experiencing any rejection from her beast will. She assured him that ever since their combat drills during the team fighting mechanics class with Professor Glory, the symptoms hadn't returned. Arthur was relieved to hear that. He reminded her to inform him or Director Goodsky if anything felt wrong, especially since his grandfather was still away in Elenoir and wouldn't be back for a few more weeks. Tessia promised she would. Her tone was steady, more confident now than when she first started training. Arthur encouraged her further. If everything continued going well, she would likely finish the beast will assimilation in a few weeks. And if they were lucky, her mana core might even rise to a higher level. But before he could finish the sentence, a sudden splash of cold water hit his face. Arthur blinked in surprise and turned toward her. Tessia was giggling, amused by his reaction. She teased that the splash was to help him cool down, reminding him that they were done for the day and still had time left during the lunch break. Arthur didn't let the moment pass. With a playful smirk, he splashed water right back at her before she could finish her sentence. He joked that she was still sweaty and needed cooling off too. The quiet training room was soon filled with laughter and the sound of water splashing. The two of them threw water at each other like children, both relaxing for the first time in a while. After some time, Tessia pulled her feet out of the pool and said she had cooled off enough. Arthur suddenly grew a little shy. He glanced down at the water, quiet now, then gently reached out and took Tessia's hand in his. His fingers wrapped around hers slowly, and he gave a soft squeeze. Tessia's breath hitched, her cheeks quickly flushing red, but the moment didn't last. A calm voice interrupted the silence. Someone had entered the room and watched them quietly, then spoke. Both Arthur and Tessia froze. Arthur turned his head quickly, startled. Standing nearby was Director Goodsky. Her expression was kind with a warm smile. As soon as Director Cynthia Goodsky appeared, Tessia quickly stood up and rushed to her side. There was concern in her eyes as she looked at her master. Cynthia, however, brushed off the worry with a gentle smile. She explained that there was nothing serious. She had simply stopped by the Mages Guild for a quick sparring session to loosen her joints and ended up with a few scrapes. Arthur, surprised, mentioned that he thought she was supposed to be meeting with the council. Cynthia replied playfully, asking if she wasn't allowed a small detour after such a formal meeting. It was her way of relieving stress, but Tessia didn't look fully convinced. She gently scolded Cynthia, asking her not to push herself so hard that it led to injuries. Cynthia nodded, assuring her that she would be more careful next time. Then she shifted the topic, asking if Tessia's next class was about to begin. She also mentioned she would be using the training room later for a lesson, hoping it wouldn't be a problem. Arthur told her it was completely fine. He and Tessia had already completed their beast will assimilation training for the day. With that, Tessia waved goodbye to Arthur, thanking him before heading off. Arthur returned the gesture, reminding her not to overdo things. As Tessia walked away, Arthur stole a glance back at Cynthia. Something felt off. Her smile was calm, but her energy, the way she stood, the slight stiffness. He could tell she was hiding something. Still, he knew it wasn't his place to question her further. He turned back, closed the door to the training room behind him, and made his way toward his dorm, letting the matter rest for now. The next day arrived with the usual rhythm of academy life. Arthur sat in class, visibly tired. He yawned more than once, struggling to keep his eyes open. Elijah, sitting beside him, noticed right away. He pointed out that Arthur had been yawning ever since they left the dorm. Curious, he asked how late Arthur had been out the previous night. Arthur, still groggy, said he wasn't exactly sure, but remembered that Elijah had already been asleep by the time he got back. Elijah laughed, saying even he had returned late, thanks to a club social he attended. Arthur asked which club it was this time. Elijah's eyes lit up with excitement as he revealed it was the Chain Casting Research Club, and apparently it had more girls than he expected. Arthur shot him a sarcastic remark, jokingly asking if Elijah had been deprived of love in his past life to be so eager for romance now. Elijah fired back, calling Arthur the weird one instead. He launched into a passionate declaration, talking about how their time at the academy was the perfect moment for discovering themselves and exploring relationships in a magical, youthful setting. But before he could finish his dramatic speech, Professor Avius cleared his throat sharply from the front of the classroom. The entire room fell silent. With a perfectly timed comment, Avius acknowledged Elijah's love for storytelling, but reminded him that class was in session. The students around them burst into quiet laughter, and Elijah sank into his seat, cheeks red from embarrassment. Professor Avius spoke of the tragic incident that had shaken the academy. A fellow student, Marcos, had recently passed away. The professor felt it was necessary to remind them all of the real dangers that came with using magic, a power so many had taken for granted. He explained that although the best mages and medics were still investigating the cause of Marcus's death, it was clear he had used a spell far too powerful for his body to withstand. understand. The students listened quietly as Professor Avius compared the mana core to a muscle. If pushed beyond its limits, it could lead to damage that was sometimes permanent, and sometimes fatal. One student hesitantly asked if Marcos had still been alive after the backlash. They had heard rumors that he should have survived with proper treatment, like mana recovery elixirs. Avius nodded slightly, admitting that in most cases elixirs could help, but he clarified that there were exceptions. He wasn't trying to say this was exactly what happened to Marcos, but wanted to warn them. Magical aids that forcefully enhanced mana often came with serious side effects. One of the worst was mana leakage from the core, something dangerous and difficult to control. What the professor said didn't explain the strange behavior Marcos had shown before his death, or the eerie markings on his back that had been leaking mana. Something wasn't adding up. Once the lecture ended, Arthur walked to his next class, the one where he was the instructor. Stepping in, he greeted his students and addressed them directly. Since none of them had managed to replicate what he had demonstrated in a previous lesson, he decided to give them a hint to help them understand. Arthur called Lester to the front. The boy looked nervous, unsure why he was being singled out, but followed instructions anyway. Arthur explained to the class that if Lester were his opponent, someone big and intimidating, and Arthur didn't want to get too close, as an augmenter, he would try using a long-range spell instead. He took a piece of paper and crumpled it into a loose ball. Holding it in his palm, he lightly blew at it. The paper fell harmlessly to the ground. This, he said, was what a normal, unfocused spell looked like. Then Arthur picked another piece of paper and rolled it into a tight tube like a blowpipe. He shaped another piece into a dart, placed it inside, and aimed. With a quick breath, he launched the dart straight into Lester's face. The room immediately erupted with laughter. Arthur smiled and told them that this demonstration was a big hint, especially for the augmenters. It wasn't about the spell itself, but how it was shaped and delivered. Precision mattered. As for the conjurers, he told them they would get their turn. But while the students were still laughing in the classroom, far away from the academy, a different mood filled the air. In another location entirely, the Lances, some of the strongest and most elite protectors of the continent, were gathered for a meeting. Alea had expected her next mission to be alongside Lance Aya and Eleanor, offering aid in the Elven homeland. But something had changed. Byron explained that the reason behind this meeting stemmed from something he had discovered in a dungeon near the outskirts of the Beast Glades. It wasn't just a monster or artifact, it was a clue, something unusual. Before Alea could press for more, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. From the stairs descended Lance Veray, cold and graceful as always. She wasted no time on formalities. With only the three of them present, she went straight to the point. The council, along with her, had made a decision to pull Alea from her assigned mission. The reason was deeply troubling. Unfamiliar signs had been discovered deep within certain dungeons, traces that hinted at mages not native to Decathlon. This was shocking news. Until recently, the very idea of another continent's existence had only just been confirmed. Baron supported Varay's claim. The material he had found inside the dungeon, a torn piece of cloth, was unlike anything native to Decathlon. It wasn't made from any known mana beast fiber. Even more unsettling was the fact that mana had been imbued into the fabric, a spell form embedded within it. But since the cloth had been ripped, the enchantment was already disabled, and they couldn't determine its full purpose. Varai confirmed this. While they couldn't extract more from the spell, they had another matter that required Alea's skills specifically. This second concern involved multiple reports from adventurers scattered across different regions of the Beast Glades. Sightings of titanic bloodworms had increased. While not rare beasts, the pattern of their appearances was strange. At first, there had seemed to be nothing unusual about it, but after cross-referencing the sightings with the research of mana beast behavior specialists, the signs became harder to ignore. The frequency of these bloodworm appearances and their rabid behavior seemed to suggest a deeper disturbance, possibly even a connection to something far below the surface of the dungeons. Baron admitted he had been personally leading investigations across the Beast Glades, but even with his strength, his range was limited. That was where Alea's unique abilities came in. Her sensory magic could cover far greater distances, something they now desperately needed. Lance Varay made it clear that Alea would be working alone. They didn't want to slow her down, but the risks were high. The Beast Glades were unpredictable, and the presence of corrupted mana beasts had only made them more dangerous. Baron explained that he would continue focusing on the deeper regions, but the problem was getting worse. The titanic bloodworms had started burrowing closer toward the lower dungeons, dangerously near the borders of Sapan. If those creatures surfaced there, it wouldn't just be adventurers at risk. Civilians might be caught in the chaos too. Varai briefly considered waiting for Mika to complete her mission in Darv so the two lances could handle it together, but Alea didn't hesitate. She understood the cost of delay. Students and adventurers were still out there, exploring dungeons without any idea of the lurking threat beneath them. The longer they waited, the greater the danger. With firm resolve, Alea agreed to begin the investigation immediately. There was no time to waste. For the next few weeks, nothing major happened at Zyrus Academy, but Arthur stayed incredibly busy. Between school, intense training sessions, and his responsibilities on the disciplinary committee, he hardly had a moment to spare. Even visiting his family had to be put off. One day, as Arthur stepped into the hallway near the training grounds, chaos unfolded in front of him. Curtis Glader came flying past him like a blur, unable to control his momentum. Just before he could crash straight into the wall, an icy barrier appeared out of thin air, stopping him. Princess Kathleen stood quietly nearby, wand in hand. She had conjured the ice wall in an instant, saving her brother from serious injury. Curtis didn't seem too pleased though. He was clearly annoyed that how does smashing into ice was considered an improvement over hitting a solid wall. Arthur, watching from the side, couldn't tell if Kathleen was helping or just messing with her brother. Across the training arena, Theodore leapt into the air and unleashed a powerful gravity spell. Arthur watched carefully, still trying to understand the mechanics of gravity magic. It was unlike any spell he was used to, and mastering it remained a challenge. Curtis, recovering quickly, hurled his sword ahead and raised his shield. With a sharp chant, he cast a fire spell. Flames erupted across the space between him and Theodore, but Theodore reacted just in time, sliding backward and avoiding the blast. He didn't look fazed at all, just amused. His expression said it all. He was enjoying the fight. As Curtis and Theodore prepared to go at it again, their duel was suddenly interrupted. A wave of metal strings cut through and stopped them in their tracks. Kai stood there, calm as ever, announcing that Claire had given orders to wrap things up. Arthur focused on the strings that Kai had used to stop the duel. They were nearly invisible, and despite all his training, he still couldn't understand how Kai manipulated them. It didn't feel like any known attribute. Curtis, ever the competitor, was disappointed. He believed his comeback had just begun. Theodore, on the other hand, teased him with a grin. Claire, bringing the group to attention, reminded everyone why they were gathered. Arthur, Curtis, and Claire herself would soon be heading off campus for a class assignment in the Beast Glades. Because of their absence, patrol routes would need to be rearranged, and the disciplinary committee needed volunteers to take on extra shifts. Without hesitation, Kai volunteered. He joked that it's not like he had anyone to hang out with anyway, which earned a small nod of appreciation from Claire. Ferrith, in his usual dramatic tone, offered to volunteer for extra patrol duties. He claimed quite proudly that he had no friends, which made everyone pause for a moment. Claire, taken slightly off guard, thanked him but couldn't hide her confusion at his confidence in such a lonely declaration. Meanwhile, Doradrea had grown visibly bored with all the talk until something unexpected happened. Without warning, thin metallic wires lifted her arm into the air. She was startled and confused, unsure of what was going on. Claire, noticing the raised hand, mistook it as a volunteer gesture and cheerfully acknowledged Doradrea's supposed willingness to help. Doradrea, now irritated, made it clear she hadn't intended to volunteer. Kai, standing nearby, smoothly stepped in. He mentioned that he hadn't yet had a chance to patrol with Doradrea and suggested they team up. Doradrea reluctantly agreed, but with a condition: he would have to buy her food afterward. Claire smiled, confirming that the patrol coverage was now settled, and promptly ended the meeting. As the group dispersed, Arthur began walking out of the meeting room, only to be followed by Ferrith. Ferrith, still viewing Arthur as a rival, tried to give him advice about staying safe in the wild. He spoke of his past experience in the Beast Glades and offered to share his wisdom. However, Kathleen, listening nearby, couldn't help but interject with a sarcastic remark, reminding everyone of a time when a tree rodent had stolen Ferrith's lunch. The embarrassment on Ferrith's face was instant, and he began shouting at her defensively. Arthur had enough of the antics. With a sigh, he quietly called Sylvie and started to leave. On his way out, his attention shifted toward Kai. There was something odd about the way Kai used his magic. Arthur leaned toward Claire and asked her if she knew what kind of magic Kai wielded. He couldn't sense any element or attribute from the technique Kai used earlier with the wires. Claire replied that Kai kept it a secret, and even she didn't know the exact nature of his powers. She only knew that those metallic wires were special, just like Kai himself. Arthur considered the possibility that the wire Kai used could be masking the mana attribute of his spell. Just then, Kai leaned in, his usual sly smirk in place, teasing Arthur with the idea that he might be interested in him. Arthur didn't deny it. He was indeed curious, especially about the way Kai controlled those metallic wires. Kai, ever the enigma, only replied with a playful warning, suggesting that revealing his secrets might cost Arthur his life. The tension between them lingered for a moment before Claire stepped in, annoyed, and separated the two. She reminded them all that they had class to attend and quickly ushered them along. Later that day, Elijah was out on the training grounds, practicing against a Toby, one of Gideon's mechanical training dolls. Using his earth magic, Elijah summoned sharp shards of stone that burst through the ground and struck the Toby hard, blasting it off its feet. Pleased with the impact, he grinned and conjured an even larger boulder to finish it off. But the Toby had a surprise in store. Without warning, it raised one arm and unleashed a spinning wave of fire that launched toward Elijah like a missile. Caught off guard, Elijah froze. The sight of fire magic coming from the Toby stunned him completely. Before the flames could reach him, Arthur leapt into action, dragging Elijah out of the way just in time. The fire missed by inches. Elijah was still stunned, confused about how the Toby Toby could use fire. Arthur explained that Gideon, the eccentric professor, often tinkered with the dolls and added unpredictable upgrades, likely to keep Arthur sharp during training. Elijah's awe grew. The idea of watching Gideon work on his creations fascinated him. He admitted that artificing had always intrigued him, even as a child, though he never pursued it seriously. Magic just seemed more impressive. Arthur, catching on, nudged him jokingly, teasing that Elijah only learned magic to impress girls. Embarrassed, Elijah half denied it, only for Arthur to toss a wooden sword his way, telling him that even conjurers needed to understand the basics of close combat. Arthur smiled teasingly as he looked at Elijah, hinting that maybe all his training was just to impress the girls. That simple remark pushed Elijah over the edge. Enraged, he charged at Arthur with his sword raised, yelling out in frustration. But Arthur blocked the attack easily, laughing under his breath. He couldn't help but be sarcastic. Elijah's swings weren't bad. In fact, they showed skill. Arthur asked if Elijah had trained in sword fighting when he was younger, noting how surprisingly decent he was. Elijah, still attacking, admitted it didn't feel like much since Arthur was countering every move so effortlessly. But Arthur, deep in thought, noticed something important. Elijah's movements were tight, with little wasted motion. His footwork was strong, always balanced. Arthur could see it. If Elijah trained seriously, he could become a strong swordsman, and paired with his rare metal magic, he could be truly dangerous. Suddenly, Elijah roared, putting all his strength into one final strike. He lunged forward with everything he had, but Arthur simply stepped aside at the last moment, barely moving, and tapped Elijah on the back. Elijah lost his balance and crashed face first into the ground. Groaning in pain, Elijah complained as he got up. Arthur reminded him that he had lost his temper and opened himself up. Before Elijah could finish his frustrated sentence, something strange happened. His eyes widened in shock. Behind Arthur, he saw a faint reflection, like a ghost, wearing royal clothes, standing exactly as Arthur was. Elijah froze. Words began to echo through his head. Guilt, rage, anger, betrayal, envy. The emotions flooded in all at once. His head started to throb violently. He felt overwhelmed and confused. Unable to bear the pressure, he screamed and collapsed to the ground. Arthur rushed to him, worried, calling his name and asking if he was all right. Inside his mind, Elijah tried to make sense of what was happening. Why was he feeling all of this? Where were these emotions coming from? Arthur reached out to help, saying they should go to the medical ward, but Elijah quickly sat up and said he was fine. The pain had stopped. Arthur asked again, what had happened? What was gone? Elijah avoided the question and claimed it was just a headache from hitting his head earlier. He insisted he'd head back first to clean up. Deep down, he tried to convince himself that it was nothing more than the fall. That had to be it. As he turned away, Elijah waved, telling Arthur he'd see him back at the dorm. Arthur stood there, still concerned, and called back to him, but his voice was hesitant. Something didn't feel right. In the weeks that followed, Arthur's days passed in a quiet and steady rhythm. Life at the academy felt peaceful, perhaps even a bit dull at times. Though mid-cycle exams were approaching, the excitement of learning was slowly giving way to routine. Despite that, Arthur's magic continued to grow stronger with the support of his teachers and his friend Toby, but none of it made him forget why he truly chose to attend this school. It wasn't just about magic or becoming stronger, it was about the people he had come to care about, the moments he shared with them that made each day feel worth waking up to. One afternoon, Arthur was speaking to Elijah, trying to share something about his classmates, but Elijah didn't respond. He was clearly lost in his own thoughts. When Arthur called out again, Elijah blinked and finally reacted, asking what Arthur had said. Arthur noticed how distracted Elijah had been lately. He asked if Elijah was all right. Elijah just shook his head and said it was nothing, blaming stress from the upcoming exams. Then he reminded Arthur about the Beast Glades excursion with Professor Glory's class, and casually warned him not to overdo it, especially during training with Tessia. With that, Elijah waved and walked off, saying he'd see Arthur later. Arthur quietly responded, his voice hesitant, and watched him go. As Elijah disappeared into the distance, Sylvie spoke, commenting on how Elijah seemed angry with him lately. Arthur felt a bit relieved that she noticed it too. At least it wasn't just in his head. Later that day, Arthur found himself in the training room with Tessia. They were working on refining their abilities, and Arthur noticed how much more stable her beast will was now within her mana core. He complimented her progress, acknowledging how far she'd come. Tessia responded confidently, certain that the mana beasts they would face wouldn't be able to stand against her. Arthur, however, wasn't about to let that confidence get too high. He reached out and flicked her forehead lightly, reminding her not to get ahead of herself. He pointed out that because of the assimilation process, she likely wasn't even using half of her real strength yet. She reminded Arthur that he himself was heading into the dangerous Beast Glades, while still holding back his two strongest elements. Arthur reminded Tessia with a smug tone that he could always remove his limiter if needed. Tessia, not backing down, replied firmly that she didn't need to be babied. After all, she was still a year older than him. But Arthur, trying to justify his concern, awkwardly pointed out that more mana beasts would be drawn to their position if they saw her outside, since she still looked like a kid. So in the name of safety, she should stay inside the tent. But Tessia wasn't having it. Frustrated, she lunged at Arthur, tackling him to the ground and jabbing him hard. Arthur couldn't stop laughing, even as he gasped that it hurt. That only irritated her more, and she continued her onslaught. Eventually, she let up, and Arthur lay on the ground trying to catch his breath, while Tessia sat on top of him. That's when Varian, Tessia's grandfather, appeared. He took one look at them and raised his brows, clearly amused by what he had walked into. His teasing words hit Tessia like a bolt. Realizing the awkward position they were in, she blushed deeply and quickly jumped off Arthur, both of them scrambling away from each other in embarrassment. Arthur, trying to recover, asked Varian what he was doing back in Xyrus, since he thought the old elf would be busy in council meetings. Varian replied casually that he had escaped for a breather, just to check up on his precious granddaughter, who now seemed all grown up. That only embarrassed Tessia more. She stomped forward and tugged at her grandfather's beard, demanding him to stop making things awkward. Varian yelped in pain, trying to shield his beard from her angry grip. The lighthearted moment faded as Varian admitted he was a bit worried. With a dungeon excursion planned for the next day, he originally wanted Cynthia to watch over Tessia just in case her mana core flared up again, but Cynthia was unavailable, so he asked Arthur to stay with Tessia until his own school field trip the following day. Arthur, always polite but firm, hesitated. He had already promised to visit his family tonight, wanting to spend some time with them before the upcoming mission. Varian, however, seemed to find that perfect, and immediately suggested that Arthur just bring Tessia along with him. Arthur was horrified. The thought of showing up at home with Tessia, especially considering the teasing his parents would unleash, was too much. He strongly refused, trying to shut the idea down completely. But somehow, as the evening fell, Arthur found himself standing in front of the Helstia estate, Tessia beside him. He still couldn't believe he had caved. As the door swung open, his mother, Alice, greeted them with a knowing look and a voice full of warmth, saying it was about time the two of them arrived. Arthur was surprised how his mother, Alice, already knew Tessia would be coming with him. As he peeked into the house, the hallway was filled with gifts from the Elven Kingdom. Clearly, they had prepared for her arrival in advance. His father, Reynolds, simply said they had a feeling she might come, while Alice called out, urging them both to come inside since dinner was almost ready. Inside, Ellie was overjoyed to see Tessia and immediately grabbed her hand, excited to show her the progress she had made with her bow skills. She proudly mentioned how Helen trained her every time the Twin Horns visited and pulled Tessia along eagerly. The house was filled with warmth and laughter. Everyone gathered for dinner, sharing food, drinks, and endless conversation. It was a rare moment of peace and joy. Vincent, however, had one too many drinks, and by the end of the evening, he was completely drunk. Arthur and Tabitha had to support him from both sides just to keep him steady. Lilia, clearly used to her father's antics, was annoyed. She joked that if he kept getting drunk every time she visited, she might stop coming home altogether. Vincent, in his drunken state, whined like a child, while Tabitha reminded Lilia that her father already regretted sending her away to Xyrus Academy. He missed her deeply. Lilia, still fuming, mentioned how embarrassed she felt when her father had told all those stories, especially in front of the student council president. Then she realized Tessia was nowhere to be seen. Arthur told her that Tessia had stepped out for some fresh air, and Alice had gone with her to make sure she didn't get lost. When Arthur offered to carry Ellie to her room, Reynolds passed her gently into his arms. He said it would be better if Arthur took her himself, especially since Ellie asked about him every single day. Reynolds suggested Arthur tell her that he'd be leaving in the morning, just in case she woke up late. Outside, Alice and Tessia walked together under the night sky. Alice thanked her for coming and acknowledged that it probably wasn't easy for her, but Tessia genuinely said she had fun. Watching the chaos caused by Lilia and Arthur's fathers had been amusing. Alice smiled knowingly and corrected her, saying the right word was probably embarrassing. Tessia chuckled in agreement. Perhaps it was both. Tessia looked concerned and gently asked Alice if she was worried about Arthur heading into the dungeon the next day. Alice didn't hide her feelings. She admitted she was. Even though Arthur had grown incredibly strong, Alice explained that dungeons were unpredictable by nature. No amount of strength could guarantee safety inside them, and her worries as a mother wouldn't go away just because her son had power. She apologized, not wanting to frighten Tessia before her own journey. Tessia, however, reassured her. She told Alice that just like Arthur had always protected her, she would do the same for him if anything ever went wrong. It was her way of showing gratitude and loyalty. But Alice's response surprised her. With a warm but firm tone, Alice told Tessia not to. She reminded her that she too was someone's daughter, just as precious to her own parents. If something happened to Tessia, how would her family bear it? Alice expressed that her trust was in Arthur to take care of himself. She didn't want Tessia risking her life for him. A gentle pause settled between them before Alice noted that the cold night air was getting to her. She asked if Tessia wanted to head back inside, but Tessia chose to stay a little longer, thanking Alice for showing her around the place. Alice smiled softly before leaving her alone with her thoughts. Later that night, Arthur carried Ellie to her room and gently laid her in bed. Just as he was about to pull the blanket over her, she stirred awake. Her voice was groggy, but her question was clear. She wanted to know what time it was. Arthur quietly told her it was still nighttime, but Ellie, knowing his visit was brief, asked the real question. When was he leaving? Arthur hesitated, but answered truthfully. He would be gone by morning. There was sadness in Ellie's voice as she asked if he couldn't stay just a little longer. Arthur could only smile softly and explain that he couldn't, but he promised her that after the dungeon field trip, he would be back for a whole week. Ellie, not ready to let him go yet, made a request. She asked him to tell her a few stories before sleeping. Arthur hesitated at first, explaining he had to wake up early, but when Ellie gently patted the space beside her on the bed, asking him to join, he couldn't refuse. With a soft sigh, Arthur gave in and asked what story she wanted to hear. Ellie reminded him of the story he had once started but never finished, the one about how he became a professor. Arthur paused, trying to recall where he had left off, and then it came back to him. He explained that during a demonstration, Professor Geist had used an Ember Wisp spell, which couldn't be stopped once cast. At that moment, Princess Kathleen had been defenseless. Ellie asked if she was the daughter of the King of Sapin. Arthur nodded, explaining that he had stepped in and pulled her out of danger. Ellie was surprised to hear the name and teased him lightly for saving another princess. But Arthur quickly defended himself. He insisted he didn't go around rescuing royalty on purpose. After saving Kathleen, he had challenged Professor Geist to a duel in her place. Ellie joked that he must have done it to impress the princess, which made Arthur respond by pinching her nose in playful protest. He continued the story, saying that after he defeated Professor Geist, the director of Zyrus Academy reached out and offered him a position as a teacher. Ellie was curious if he had accepted it right away. Arthur made it clear that he hadn't. He had rejected their offers repeatedly until they granted him access to a special part of the library, one that was normally reserved only for certain professors. That privilege had been worth it to him. When Ellie asked if that was the only reason, Arthur admitted there were a few more perks. He also received a private training room lined with mana crystals, which helped him train more effectively. On top of that, the other teachers and disciplinary committee officers were more lenient with him, giving him extra freedom and time to focus on his growth. Ellie's curiosity didn't fade. She looked up at Arthur and asked if he was a good teacher. Arthur responded confidently, saying that even students who weren't in his class came just to watch his lectures. Ellie, ever the teasing younger sister, gave a look that said she wasn't quite convinced. Arthur playfully called her a brat in return. She then asked if Arthur used the training room with Elijah and Tessia. Arthur admitted that he did train with them sometimes, but lately he'd been spending more time helping Gideon, who was making great progress with his latest invention, Toby. Ellie blinked in confusion and asked what Toby was. Arthur chuckled, ready to explain. Their conversation drifted from one topic to another, filling the night with soft laughter, quiet questions, and stories from Arthur's life away from home. They hadn't had a moment like this in a long time, and neither wanted it to end. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the house was still quiet. Alice noticed Arthur's room was empty and asked Reynold if he had seen their son. Reynold guessed he might already be downstairs, eating breakfast, but Alice looked unsure. She wondered aloud if he had already left for the field trip, though it seemed too early. Reynold suggested checking on Ellie. As the two parents quietly made their way to Ellie's room and peeked inside, their hearts softened at the sight before them. Arthur had fallen asleep sitting upright on Ellie's bed. Ellie lay curled up beside him, her small head resting on his lap. Meanwhile, far away, deep within the twisting tunnels of a dark cave, Lancelea moved quietly through the stone corridors. The walls were lined with thick vines, and every few steps she paused to check the ground. The trail of the titanic bloodworm split once again. Just as Lance Foray had suspected, something wasn't right. These creatures weren't just wandering without reason. The way the tunnels twisted and converged into one direction confirmed her suspicion. Everything was being pulled toward a single point, further down and east, deep beneath the Grand Mountains. Aaliyah moved swiftly, her footsteps light but determined as she dashed deeper into the cave, following the trail of twisted vines and disturbed earth. The tunnel turned sharply east, and she took the path without hesitation. But just as the ground began to drop beneath her, she skidded to a stop, halting herself before running straight off the edge of a hidden cliff. Her eyes scanned the deep chasm below. At the bottom, two massive serpents writhed and hissed, their bodies glowing faintly with a strange light. Aaliyah immediately recognized the species. They were Hades serpents, beasts known for their ferocity and their rare fire-lined bodies. But something was off. These ones weren't the typical gray with blue fire that had been recorded in past reports. Their coloring was darker, almost sickly, and more importantly, they were guarding something. That alone defied all known behavior of the species. Hades serpents were known to abandon their young, creatures that cared little for territory, let alone tunnels. Raising her hand, Aleia activated the communication core embedded in her wrist. A soft glow lit her face as she sent her report to Lance Foray. She described the presence of a mutated Hades serpent, its abnormal appearance, and the powerful mana source radiating from the tunnel it guarded. Lance Foray's voice returned quickly in her earpiece, firm and trusting. She left the judgment to Aleia, confident in her assessment. Aleia in turn confirmed her suspicion. The serpent's strange colors matched the patterns seen in other deviant mana beasts recently sighted. There was no doubt it was all connected. She requested immediate backup. Without delay, Virai responded. 50 battle mages were ready for deployment through the nearest teleportation gate. Aaliyah was ordered to hold position until further instruction. Aaliyah lowered her arm, her eyes never leaving the serpents below. The quiet hum of mana still pulsed through the air as she remained alert. Arthur gave one last wave to his family before stepping into the carriage. Once inside, he followed Sylvie's example and let himself drift into sleep during the long journey ahead. When they finally arrived, the carriage came to a gentle stop and Arthur stepped out into the sunlight. Curtis was the first to greet him, waving with a wide grin. Arthur made his way toward the group of students already gathered at the dungeon's front gate. Professor Glory smiled as she acknowledged his arrival and began counting heads to make sure everyone had arrived safely. Arthur knew this was a good opportunity. While others focused on exploration, Sylvie could use the time outside the dungeon to sharpen her hunting skills. Sylvie, still resting on his shoulder, questioned the idea through their bond, concerned, but Arthur reassured her. Confident and calm, he reminded her of the low danger and the fact that Glory would be watching over them the entire time. Hearing that, Sylvie jumped off his shoulder and agreed to let him handle things, asking only that he call if anything went wrong. As Arthur scanned the group, his gaze stopped at Lucas Wykes. Internally, he sighed. It still annoyed him that Professor Glory had paired him with Lucas of all people. Lucas stood confidently in front of the other students, speaking loudly about how many times he had already visited this dungeon. He claimed it had gotten too easy for him, boasting about his status as an A-class adventurer. Around him, students whispered in awe, clearly impressed by his reputation and noble lineage. Arthur, unimpressed, made a remark aloud about how he had heard Lucas's adventurer license had been revoked, information he had gotten from a friend who worked in the field. Then, without giving Lucas time to react, Arthur walked away and waved at Tessia, heading in her direction. But Lucas didn't let it go. Irritated, he grabbed Arthur's shoulder from behind. He demanded to know if Arthur was jealous of his popularity. Arthur, calm and unbothered, simply pointed out that he had only told the truth. Lucas's hand clenched tightly, his fury barely contained. But before things escalated, Clive stepped in. Clive, keeping his tone neutral but firm, reminded them that they still needed to choose a team leader before entering the dungeon. Lucas, clearly expecting the role to be his, scoffed at the suggestion of a vote. But before he could finish claiming leadership, every student raised their hand at once, united in their vote for Tessia. Tessia, caught off guard, stuttered in surprise. She glanced toward Arthur, clearly unsure why the group had chosen her. But Arthur, calm and supportive, reminded her that she already had leadership experience as the student council president. He also pointed out that, as a mid-range conjurer, she was in the best position to monitor and support the team from the center during their exploration. Roland cracked a joke, calling their newly formed team the Queen and her Knights. Even though it was in good humor, Lucas stood silently, gritting his teeth at the comment. The air around him grew tense, but no one gave it much attention. Professor Glory soon gathered everyone and reminded them to be prepared. She emphasized the importance of remembering each other's abilities, using basic formations, and sticking to what they had been taught in class. Her tone carried a sharp clarity, and with that, the group began their journey toward the dungeon. They moved quickly through the forest. The path was thick with trees, but eventually the dense foliage gave way, and the group found themselves descending a slope. Professor Glory continued her instructions, warning them to stay in their teams and shield their bodies with mana at all times. As the temperature dropped sharply, Roland shivered uncontrollably. The cold took him by surprise. Clive, unaffected, reminded him with a firm voice that he should have aligned his mana properly as instructed. Arthur, however, noticed something different. Despite not using mana actively, the cold didn't seem to affect his body the same way. He realized that his assimilation with Sylvia's dragon will had enhanced his natural resistance. Tessia, walking beside Arthur, looked around with wide eyes. Even with the creeping darkness and bone-chilling air, she couldn't help but admire the haunting beauty of the dungeon's interior. Professor Glory reminded them once again about their location. This was a D-class dungeon, and for their safety, they would only explore the first 2 floors. She explained that the only mana beasts they needed to be cautious of were the Snarlers. One of the older girls in the group spoke up, mentioning that she had read about the creatures. While not especially strong, Snarlers were difficult to kill because of their thick fur. Another girl added that their appearance made close combat uncomfortable, calling them disgusting. Curtis looked around as they moved deeper and noted something odd. There hadn't been any signs of other adventurers or beast remains, even though Snarlers usually appeared frequently on the first floor. Claire, walking just behind, recalled that Professor Glory had made arrangements with the Adventurers Guild to block access to the dungeon for a few weeks. That should have meant a clear environment, but it didn't explain the complete absence of any activity. As the group ventured deeper into the dungeon, Professor Glory grew uneasy. In her mind, the silence was unnatural. By now, they should have already faced a decent number of Snarlers. Something wasn't right. Out loud, she reminded everyone to stay alert. Even if no mana beast had shown up yet, she warned them not to relax. The cave could be hiding dangers they couldn't couldn't yet see. Lucas, clearly frustrated, questioned the point of being there at all. Roland, more curious than annoyed, asked what they would do if no beasts appeared in either of the first 2 floors. Would they go deeper? Professor Glory immediately shut down the idea. There was no chance they would explore beyond the first 2 levels. If there were truly no beasts around, they'd simply report back to the Adventurers Guild. Curtis, trying to be helpful, suggested they could look for mana beasts outside the dungeon instead. But before he could finish, he walked straight into Professor Glory, who had come to a sudden halt. Her eyes were wide, her body still as if frozen by fear. From behind scattered boulders and out of the small caverns along the walls, glowing red eyes began to appear, one after another, until the entire cave seemed to blink with them. Dozens, maybe hundreds of snarlers revealed themselves at once. The sight was enough to silence even the most talkative of the group. Roland swallowed hard, his fear showing clearly on his face. He wasn't the only one who looked shaken. Everyone was stunned. Arthur reacted quickly. He grabbed Roland by the cloak and rushed backward, urging him to follow the professor's command. The snarlers began pouring out of hiding, jaws snapping, growling as they charged. Professor Glory stood her ground. In a fluid motion, she drew her blade and slashed through the first wave. In a single, clean swing, she cut down dozens of the beasts, her strength and precision on full display. But even as she made quick work of the creatures, her mind raced. The snarlers weren't individually stronger than normal, but something about their numbers felt wrong. They shouldn't be swarming like this, not in such massive hordes. She called out to the group, announcing her decision. The mission was over. The safety of the students came first. She ordered everyone to start retreating toward the stairs. Just as the group began to move back, a sudden fireball shot past her. It exploded on impact, blasting 6 snarlers off their feet and leaving them lifeless on the ground. Everyone turned in shock. Lucas stood behind, clearly the one who cast the fireball. His expression showed no regret. The group murmured among themselves, some agreeing with him. The snarlers seemed to go down easily. Maybe it wasn't such a big threat after all. After all, it was just a D-class dungeon. Professor Glory stood in deep thought as Curtis suggested continuing the training. Arthur could understand her hesitation, especially with the lances already investigating strange activity in the dungeons. But Glory knew this might be the only chance for her students to gain real experience from an actual dungeon. The snarlers were weak E-class beasts. As long as she stayed close, they would be safe. She made her decision. With a firm motion, she drove her sword into the ground, declaring the training would proceed. The students quickly split into their assigned teams. Their excited voices echoed as they responded in unison and rushed forward. Glory, however, didn't let her guard down. She turned her attention to Lucas and warned him with a sharp glare. He gave a reluctant nod, clearly not pleased but understanding the warning. Tessia took charge of her group immediately. She placed Arthur at the front, trusting his close combat ability to lead them. Roland and Clive were positioned just behind Arthur, one to his left and the other to his right. Their job was to cover Arthur's flanks, even if a few enemies got past them. Lucas was placed at the center, following the diamond formation they had practiced. But instead of following orders, Lucas sped ahead, brushing off Tessia's instructions. Clive was annoyed, but Arthur held him back, telling him to ignore it. Bigger threats needed their focus. Arthur pointed toward a small pack of snarlers approaching. Everyone readied their weapons. Roland pulled out a sword hilt from his side. It had no blade. Clive, calm and focused, drew a compact metal shortbow from his dimension ring and nocked an arrow. But the moment Roland activated it, a stream of water flowed from the hilt, twisting and extending into the form of a sharp, flexible whip. Just as Arthur stepped forward to engage, Roland spotted a snarler creeping up behind him. Without hesitation, he shouted a warning. Arthur didn't even turn. His blade moved like instinct, slicing the beast cleanly in half. He smiled, acknowledging Roland's sharp eye, while Roland, still surprised by Arthur's reflexes, nodded back. The sudden sound of snarlers echoed through the dungeon, wet and guttural, crawling into the bones of everyone present. A chill ran through Arthur's spine, but he didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his sword flashing as he slashed the nearest beast in one swift motion. Beside him, Roland activated his mana whip, a stream of water emerging from his sword handle, and with one sharp crack, he severed the head of another snarl. Clive, without missing a beat, drew his short metal bow and let an arrow fly. It pierced clean through the eye of a beast closing in from the side. Lucas, reveling in the chaos, cast his signature spell. Ember wisps, small glowing orbs, began floating through the air, illuminating the battlefield in a flickering orange hue. But his arrogance left him open. A snarler lunged toward him while he was distracted, jaws wide. Before the beast could reach him, thick vines burst from the ground. Tessia's spell wrapped around the beast like iron chains. She leapt forward and with a swift motion of her blade decapitated the snarler, landing with a thud against the ground. From the back, Professor Glory kept her eyes on the battle. She noted how well the students were holding up, thanks to their training, but their energy was fading. These students were not prepared for battles that dragged on. The real danger wasn't the strength of the Snarlers, but the endless numbers. The beasts kept coming, wave after wave. Sensing the turning tide, Glory gave the order to retreat. Her voice was sharp and commanding. Tessia picked it up instantly, urging everyone to fall back. Clive acknowledged the order and the team began pulling back toward the staircase above, but not all made it in time. A snarl lunged from the side and sank its claws into Roland's leg, dragging him away from the group. His screams rang out through the stone hallways. Arthur spotted him instantly. Tessia called out in concern, but Arthur didn't stop. He told her to go and then sprinted toward Roland alone. The Snarlers were swarming the fallen boy, ready to rip him apart. Arthur ran, his thoughts sharp. The professor's command echoed in his mind. Everyone was retreating, but if he didn't act now, Roland wouldn't survive. Arthur had never used this technique in live combat. It had only been tested in theory in his mind, but there was no time to hesitate. With a quick motion, he clicked his blade free from its scabbard. A spiral of wind burst forth as mana surged into the weapon. The entire dungeon seemed to respond to the sudden pressure shift. Arthur shouted to Roland, urging him to hold on to something. Roland, groaning in pain, grabbed onto a jagged rock formation on the ground. Then Arthur unleashed it, burst blade. The force of his unsheathing was like an explosion. Razor-sharp wind blades shot forward in a wide arc, slicing through the air and tearing into the Snarlers, dragging Roland. The impact was overwhelming. Dozens of beasts were cleaved in half in a single burst. But the spell's power didn't stop there. The wave of compressed wind slammed into the stone walls behind the beasts, fracturing them. Cracks spread outward like spiderwebs, dust raining down. As Arthur reached Roland and pulled him up, a deafening sonic boom tore through the cavern. The shockwave shattered the walls, and Arthur instinctively winced at the overwhelming force. Overhead, the ceiling groaned and gave way. Icicles, jagged stalactites, and chunks of stone plummeted as two monstrous figures descended, their enormous wings slicing through the air. The two queen Snarlers hovered above the chaos, their terrifying screeches echoing through the hollow cave. Their arrival sent a wave of fear across everyone present. Professor Glory stared at them in disbelief. These creatures were never supposed to surface from the lowest levels of the dungeon, yet here they were. Without hesitation, the twin queens dived toward Glory, their wings folding inward as they accelerated. Without flinching, Glory removed the seal, disguised as a necklace, from around her neck and slammed it onto the ground. The surge of mana around her shifted violently. With fury in her eyes, she summoned another colossal sword from her dimension ring, fully prepared for the onslaught. The queen Snarlers struck first, both slashing their massive claws toward her. Glory met their attacks head-on with her dual swords, sparks flying as steel clashed with bone and muscle. With a burst of elemental power, her weapons ignited, one in flames, the other crackling with sand-like energy. The blast from her strike pushed the beasts back, forcing them to skid across the ground. Glory didn't let up. Using the momentum, she launched herself into the air. Soaring above the two creatures, she brought both swords crashing down, one landing on the body of the smaller queen, the other slamming into the wings of the larger. Her dual elemental augmenting ability, melding fire and earth, unleashed projectiles that pierced through the smaller queen like icy spears. The beast howled before crumpling, defeated. Even as the larger queen steadied itself again, Glory didn't retreat. She turned to the students and ordered them to clear the exit. Her priority was to hold the line. Arthur acknowledged the urgency. In his mind, he knew what had to be done. They had to guide everyone across the deep chasm, break through whatever blockade awaited them, and make sure no one was left behind. Amidst the chaos and deafening roars, Arthur's sharp eyes locked onto a young mage channeling wind and earth magic. He recognized her, Delphine. Without hesitation, he moved toward her, knowing he'd need her skills to help open a way out. Behind him, Tessia stood firm, her staff glowing with vibrant energy. She called out to him, assuring him that she and the others would cover their advance. Vines burst from her staff, lashing forward and impaling Snarlers in their path. The air was thick with the scent of scorched fur and the echoing screeches of beasts. As Arthur and Delphine sprinted toward the blocked exit, Clive supported them from the rear, loosing mana-infused arrows that sliced cleanly through the air. They reached the chasm, only to find the path obstructed as expected. Arthur turned to Delphine. He needed her to patch the gap using her earth magic. She hesitated for a moment but agreed, though it was clear it wouldn't be quick. Suddenly, Curtis shouted a warning from the distance. A snarl had slipped through and was charging straight at Delphine while her back was turned. Fear froze her, and her eyes shut in panic, but before the beast could reach her, Arthur moved with terrifying speed. His blade pierced clean through the creature's skull. He withdrew it with a swift motion, the blood dripping off as he stood protectively beside her, reminding her to focus. Delphine, gathering her courage, closed her eyes and channeled her mana. The ground trembled as rocks erupted and reassembled into firm platforms. She was building a passage. Her spell work was precise, the path sturdy. The defeat of one of the Queen Snarlers earlier had reignited the fighting spirit among the students. The tide was beginning to shift, their defense now sharper, more coordinated. Delphine Delphine finished the structure and gave Arthur a nod. The exit was nearly within reach. In front of them, however, lay a mountain of rocks and debris sealing the final passage. Arthur took a breath and clenched his fist, mana surging through his arm. With a roar, he smashed it into the barrier, rocks exploding in all directions. Delphine supported the impact with her earth magic, controlling the spread and protecting their side. The air suddenly grew thick with a horrible stench, the sharp smell of rotting flesh burning its way through everyone's nose. Arthur and Delphine quickly looked around to find the source. It didn't take long to notice the pile of dead snarlers, hundreds of them, scattered and crushed beneath the rubble. The smell drifted stronger, making many of the students gag and cough as the air inside the dungeon became harder to breathe. Arthur's eyes scanned the area. Smoke was starting to build up fast. Lucas, overwhelmed by the swarm of beasts, had been throwing intense fire spells, burning through the grotesque bodies. But the growing smoke was now choking their only source of clean air. The fire spells were turning the corpses into ash and toxic fumes, and those same bodies were blocking the dungeon's only remaining airway. Realizing the danger, Arthur immediately stopped everyone from using fire magic and asked them to extinguish any remaining flames. If they didn't act fast, there would be no oxygen left to cast spells or even remain conscious. Thinking quickly, Arthur turned to Delphine. They needed a powerful blast, not careful excavation, to break through the wall of debris and clear an escape path. There was no time to play safe when everyone was on the brink of suffocation. Just then, Sylvie reached out to Arthur through their mental connection. Sensing his distress, she asked what was wrong. Arthur quickly informed her that they were trapped in the dungeon and asked her to check the exterior of the passage. Sylvie offered to help immediately, but Arthur hesitated, not wanting her to risk herself. That pause sparked a memory. Arthur remembered Curtis and his bond, Grotter. If Sylvie couldn't intervene, maybe Grotter's powers could be the answer. Arthur called Curtis over and asked whether his World Howl spell could be strong enough to break through the blockage. Curtis admitted that while the spell had power, he didn't have enough mana to cast it without Grotter by his side. Arthur didn't waste time. He ordered Curtis to prepare for the spell and focus on reaching his first phase. There was no room for questions. Delphine was told to help the others hold the line against the remaining snarlers while Arthur handled the mana transfer. As Delphine sprinted off to assist the front lines, Arthur steadied himself and removed the magical seal on his wrist. Instantly, all four elements began to swirl around him: earth, fire, water, and wind. He recalled the complex knowledge behind mana transference. It had long been considered impossible. Even mages who shared elemental affinities couldn't transfer mana because their internal balance of elements was unique. But Arthur was different. As a quadra elemental, he could control and adjust the ratio of each elemental type, allowing him to mimic and send the correct form of mana. He hadn't mastered this technique, and he had only tested it a few times, but there was no other choice. With focus and precision, Arthur placed both hands firmly on Curtis's back. A massive surge of raw mana flowed through him and into the prince. The force of it pushed Curtis down to one knee, his body straining to absorb the sudden wave of energy. Arthur couldn't shake the thoughts flooding his mind. Inwardly, he admitted his mistake. He had been too careless today. When entering the dungeon, he was overly confident, believing that even if things went wrong, he could handle it. The strength he now held at such a young age, especially compared to his previous life, had made him reckless. He realized that arrogance had taken root without him even noticing. He knew reaching the white core would require far more time and discipline. He could no longer afford to act without caution. Even now, the mana from Curtis's beast will was rejecting him. His body wasn't ready. His control wasn't complete. Curtis, sensing the shift of mana, called out. He could feel the buildup, his body responding to the flow of energy Arthur had transferred. Without hesitation, Curtis dropped into a crouch, stabilizing himself for the force he was about to unleash. Mana surged both from his own reserves and the surrounding atmosphere, concentrating at the front of his open jaw. A powerful roar tore through the air as Curtis released his first phase breath attack. The force of it shattered the rubble ahead, and a massive explosion followed. Dust and debris flew, revealing a clear path to the staircase leading out of the dungeon. The escape was finally visible. Arthur immediately called everyone to move. Curtis responded with urgency, pushing the others forward. Meanwhile, Professor Glory was still battling atop the Queen's snarl. With incredible speed, she slashed at the beast's arm, drawing a roar of pain from the monstrous creature. As the Queen stumbled back, Glory didn't stop. She followed with a furious twin blade strike. The deviant magic she used, a blend of her dual elemental affinities, created sharp glass-like shards that pierced through the Queen Snarl's body. The impact sent the beast crashing hard to the ground. Arthur watched closely. Even with all that power, unique deviant magic, and the precision of an experienced A-class adventurer, Glory was being pushed back. It shouldn't be this difficult. Something was clearly wrong. Curtis gathered everyone and yelled for them to run toward the exit. Arthur in that moment scanned the group and saw her. Tessia was a few yards behind, falling to her knees. She clutched her abdomen, her face twisted in pain. She whispered that something was happening to her mana core. Arthur rushed to her side, catching her just in time before she collapsed completely. He told her to hold on. They were almost out, but his mind was racing. This dungeon wasn't normal. Two Queen Snarlers Snarlers? That alone was strange. Queen-class monsters were supposed to be rare, and having 2 of them inside what should have been a standard B-class dungeon didn't make sense. On top of that, Queen Snarlers weren't supposed to be this strong. Professor Glory, an A-class adventurer with high-tier deviant magic, should have handled them with ease. Arthur was startled as the ground began to shake violently. The cave rumbled with a low, menacing growl. His eyes darted forward, just in time to see Professor Glory collapse to her knees, frozen in shock. A grotesque sight unfolded before them. The second Queen Snarler, larger and more vicious, had begun feeding on the corpse of the fallen queen. Arthur watched, stunned and confused. This kind of behavior was unnatural. It wasn't just disturbing, it was wrong. As the creature devoured its own kind, a horrifying transformation took place. Its once dull, gray fur turned pitch black. It no longer looked like just another beast. It looked like a monster born of madness. Professor Glory, still speechless, took slow steps back as the mutated queen turned its eyes on her. But before she could warn the group, the beast lunged forward. Its massive claws slammed into her with terrifying force. She blocked the attack using both of her swords, but the impact was too much. She was sent skidding backwards across the cave floor, her weapons barely keeping her upright. As the mutated Queen Snarler turned its attention to the others trying to escape, Arthur saw its bloodlust shift. The creature had sensed the movement of the group, its hunger now focused on new prey. But before it could advance further, a flurry of razor-sharp glass shards flew through the air, pelting the creature with explosive force. Created from Professor Glory's unique magic, slammed into the beast like missiles, staggering it for just a moment. Seizing the opportunity, Professor Glory dashed forward again. She roared with defiance, drawing the beast's attention back to herself. Arthur watched her closely. Even with her strength and mastery over deviant magic, she was being pushed beyond her limits. He could see the exhaustion in her movements. It was clear. If this continued, she might not survive. Claire called out to Arthur, urging him to retreat. Curtis's voice echoed the same desperation. They were all trying to get away. Arthur turned toward Tessia, who was still weak, and placed her in Claire's arms. He trusted her to get Tess to safety. Claire stared at him, realizing his intent. She questioned it, hoping he wouldn't actually stay behind, but Curtis rushed over, grabbing Arthur's wrist, pleading with him not to do anything foolish. Arthur, though, had already made up his mind. As Curtis held on, Arthur's hand ignited with flames, bright blue and blazing with intense heat. The mana around him pulsed with raw power. Curtis stepped back in shock as Arthur's killing intent became clear. He wasn't going to run, he was going to fight. Claire stood frozen. What she saw couldn't be ignored. The flames, the aura, they were real. Curtis was just as stunned, unable to look away from the power Arthur had just revealed. The battle between Professor Glory and the mutated Queen Snarler had reached its most intense moment. Despite all of Glory's powerful attacks, the creature showed no signs of slowing down. It was stronger, faster, and more resilient than anything she had faced before. Each clash shook the cave, each blow from the Queen forcing Glory further back. Glory, trying to keep her focus, couldn't hide her confusion. She knew some mana beasts devoured each other, but never had she seen one evolve in such a monstrous way right after. This transformation made no sense. Something about this dungeon was deeply unnatural. Suddenly, Arthur screamed for her to duck. In the next instant, he surged forward, wrapped in a swirling mix of wind and blue fire, slamming into the mutated Queen and pushing it away with sheer force. Glory was stunned, not just by his sudden appearance, but by the fact that he could now wield fire. The beast didn't wait. With a furious roar, it charged back at them, claws raised. Glory shouted at Arthur, reminding him she had already ordered everyone to escape, but Arthur refused to fall back. He reminded her he was a professor now too, and with that, he darted under the beast's claws, striking at its exposed side. Together, they moved in sync, dodging the heavy swipes of the Queen's claws. Arthur had noticed something earlier. The Queen had not been hurt by any of Glory's previous attacks. He pointed it out, more as a tactical note than criticism. Glory, still sharp in the heat of battle, fired back a comment of her own, but in that moment, the tension between them shifted into trust. She allowed him space to try his own approach. Arthur took that moment to check the cave's entrance. The rest of the students had made it out. Only Lucas was still visible, and he turned away the moment their eyes met. Arthur confirmed to Glory that they were alone now. Glory quickly laid out the plan. The Queen couldn't be allowed to leave the dungeon. They had to weaken it enough to escape while keeping it occupied. Arthur agreed and asked for 10 seconds, just 10 seconds of distraction. Without hesitation, Glory launched forward, using another wave of mana to grab the Queen's attention. Meanwhile, Arthur drew his sword. He returned the sheath to his dimension ring and gripped the blade with both hands. With the last of his mana, he summoned lightning into the weapon. Dawn's ballad sparked and crackled in his hands. As the Queen twisted to strike Glory, Arthur shouted his signal. Glory leaped away in perfect timing, and Arthur drove his blade deep into an old wound near the creature's hip. A surge of electricity exploded through the beast's body, lightning pouring into the open wound. The mutated Queen screamed in agony, its body twitching uncontrollably as the current ravaged it from within. Without wasting a moment, Arthur tried to pull his sword back, but Professor Glory had already grabbed him by by the waist. She didn't wait. She sprinted toward the dungeon's entrance, dragging him along. Arthur fought to retrieve Dawn's ballad, but the sword slipped from his grasp. Ahead of them, the cave was filled with snarling minions, but Glory cut them down without mercy, her twin swords carving a path through the chaos. Suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. A movement along the wall caught their eyes. Before either of them could react, the mutated queen reappeared. Despite having Arthur's sword still lodged in its side, it had recovered enough for one final attack. It lunged forward with unnatural force, driven by rage and survival. Arthur turned just in time to see it. The queen's massive claw lashed out and pierced into his leg. With terrifying strength, it dragged him backward, pulling him away from the exit. Professor Glory shouted his name, reaching out with a desperate hand. The pain in Arthur's legs surged as his body was yanked violently. He could feel his strength draining with every heartbeat. As he tried to fight back, tumors began growing on the queen's body, spreading wildly across its limbs and face. He realized too late, this was no normal evolution. Before he could even react, the mutated queen exploded. Its body tore apart in a burst of blood, flesh, and shards of its exoskeleton. The violent shockwave hurled Professor Glory forward and sent Arthur tumbling through a massive hole in the ground. He called out weakly, then focused the last of his strength to stop the fall. As he plummeted, Arthur extended his limbs, desperate to catch onto anything that could break his fall. Pieces of rubble rained down around him, knocking him off balance. His right hand finally caught hold of a tree root jutting out into the hole. The bark scraped his skin as he clung tightly, but it was no use. The root slipped free and Arthur fell once more. He cursed inwardly. There was no choice now. He had to survive the fall. Even with barely any mana left, he activated his mana rotation. With his arms stretched forward, he cast a powerful burst of compressed air toward the opposite wall. The recoil of the blast forced his body against the stone wall behind him, slowing his descent. He used every last bit of mana he could gather, forcing his rotation to soften the landing. The ground approached quickly. His eyes widened and his lungs tightened as he hit the earth with bone-crushing force. The impact knocked the air out of him. He coughed violently, the pain in his chest sharp and raw. Arthur tried to roll forward to spread the pressure from the fall, but it wasn't enough. His body felt shattered, like he'd been slammed by a giant hammer. His vision blurred and his thoughts scattered, but he didn't pass out. Still gasping for air, Arthur looked around. Amidst the rubble, he saw his sword, Dawn's ballad, still buried in the lifeless body of the queen. Its twisted corpse lay nearby, torn and still. His mind raced. Enhanced senses before, and now regenerative powers. Sylvia's beast will was affecting it in impossible ways. Even in death, the queen had become something beyond a normal mana beast. Arthur limped over and pulled the blade from the body. He glanced up toward the massive hole he had fallen through. Even at full strength, climbing back up would be nearly impossible. Arthur slowly lifted his head, his body aching and weak. His blurred vision made it hard to focus, but he could see faint lights glowing along the sides of what looked like a long passageway. The area around him was silent except for the distant sound of running water. With unsteady steps, he followed the dim trail of lights, dragging his tired body through the tunnel. As he moved deeper, a brighter light appeared ahead. It led him to a waterfall cascading down into a hidden part of the dungeon. The sight was unexpectedly beautiful, a curtain of flowing water cutting across the path. Arthur pushed through the stream, but what awaited him on the other side left him stunned. He staggered back in horror, his breath caught in his throat. The beauty of the place was lost beneath a gruesome scene. The cavern was an abattoir, a chamber of death. Dozens of snarlers were piled in a grotesque heap, their twisted bodies stacked without care. But worse were the corpses that surrounded them, humans, elves, and dwarves. Some were dismembered, others torn beyond recognition. Arthur's eyes remained fixed on the horror, unable to look away. It was then he heard it, a faint voice echoing down the corridor. It was a woman's voice, calling weakly for help. He barely managed to respond, his voice dry and hoarse, but she heard him. Another faint cough followed her reply, guiding him toward the sound. Turning to the left, Arthur's heart sank. The voice had come from a figure slumped against the cavern wall. As he stepped closer, the truth struck him like a blow to the chest. It was Alea. Memories of their recent meeting rushed back. How they had spoken, how she'd left an impression on him. That moment had been only weeks ago. Now, the proud lance, a white core mage, was broken and nearly unrecognizable. Alea was bloodied, her body bruised and gasping for air. Arthur dropped to his knees in front of her, eyes wide with disbelief. He summoned mana into his palms, infusing it with the intent to heal. A soft glow wrapped around her battered form, flickering faintly against her wounds. As the healing light touched her, Alea stirred. Her voice was weak but curious as she looked at Arthur and asked if they had met before. Arthur gently reminded her of their encounter at Zyrus Academy, how she had said he was around her brother's age. Slowly, recognition returned to her wounded eyes. She recalled the boy who had once spied on Baron, but before she could finish her sentence, blood spilled from her mouth. Arthur panicked and urged her not to speak, trying once again to heal her, but Alea stopped him by clutching his hand. Her grip was faint, but there was a firm finality in it. She told him to stop. Both of them knew the truth. She couldn't be saved no matter how hard Arthur tried. Arthur whispered an apology, filled with sorrow. hero. But Aaliyah, even in her broken state, smiled faintly. She said she felt better because of him. Arthur asked if there was anything else he could do for her. Aaliyah slowly shook her head. There was nothing left. Confused and heartbroken, Arthur asked her how this had happened, how she could end up like this. A pained expression spread across Aaliyah's face. Her eyebrows tightened and the dried blood cracked around her eyes as she blinked slowly. She explained in fragments. She was still alive because he had kept her that way. Not out of mercy, but as a form of revenge for daring to strike him. Arthur's eyes filled with disbelief. Revenge? Aaliyah nodded weakly and reached out, gesturing for him to come closer. Despite her shattered core, she said she could still show him something important. She motioned for Arthur to lean closer. As he did, she gently placed her forehead against his. In that instant, Arthur's vision blurred, and then everything changed. Through the haze, Arthur saw it. The battlefield. Mages led by Aleia stood ready as a massive two-headed beast. The Hades serpent charged toward them. The mages worked together swiftly, binding the creature with thick vines. Their spells were sharp, coordinated, and relentless. Eventually, they brought the monstrous serpent down. One of the mages approached its lifeless body and plunged his sword into its chest, extracting a large mana core. For a brief second, he stared at it, until it cracked. The core shattered violently, releasing a wave of energy that threw all the mages back like rag dolls. And then came the true nightmare. A figure appeared atop the dead beast, a black-horned demon named Vritra. His presence alone made the air feel heavy. Without hesitation, Vritra summoned jagged metal spikes from thin air. Half the mages died in that very first moment, skewered and torn before they even understood what they were facing. He gave Aleia a cruel choice, fight and die or kill her own team to survive. But Aleia didn't surrender. With a roar of defiance, she ordered her remaining allies to attack. Vines burst from the ground, reaching for the demon, and the surviving mages rushed forward with everything they had left. But their efforts meant nothing. Vritra mocked their charge. He unleashed more blades and spikes, both from the ground and his own body. The attacking mages were slaughtered in seconds. Aleia's vines wrapped around him, but Vritra caught them with ease and tore them apart like dried grass. He looked down at Aleia with disdain. What came next was a nightmare made real. He ripped Aleia's arm from her shoulder with no resistance. Then he kicked her away like broken trash, sending her crashing across the battlefield. She could barely move. Around her, the screams of her soldiers echoed, their bodies torn apart one by one. Vritra wasn't done. He approached her again, grabbed both of her legs, and tore them off too, without a second of hesitation. He wasn't just trying to kill her, he was trying to destroy her, piece by piece. The screams of dying soldiers filled Aleia's ears. Some cried for help, others begged for a swift death. But there was no mercy on that battlefield. Vritra made her listen to the pain, the despair, the final breaths of her people. And then, the memory ended. Arthur staggered back from Aleia, his breath short and panicked. The images were too much. He couldn't hold it in. He doubled over and vomited, overwhelmed by the brutality and horror he had just witnessed through her fading memories. Alea's voice broke the silence. She apologized. She believed no one should have to witness what Arthur just had, especially someone so young. Arthur, however, remained firm. He understood now. He knew the horror she had lived through. He thanked her for her strength, her sacrifice, and her service. Tears streamed freely down Aleia's bloodstained face as her body trembled. Her lips trembled with fear, and in a broken whisper, she confessed her deepest truth. She didn't want to die. Without a word, Arthur moved closer. He wrapped his arms gently around Aleia, holding her frail body close. Her voice, weak and cracked, trembled in fear. She repeated her wish. She didn't want her life to end. Arthur couldn't stop the tears falling from his eyes. The pain in his chest grew as he held her tighter, as if trying to keep her soul from slipping away. He softly ran his fingers through her hair, trying to offer what little comfort he could. Aleia's breathing became faint, then slower with each passing moment. She passed away in Arthur's arms, broken, brave, and finally at peace. Arthur used his mana to open a hole in the ground beneath him. One by one, he gently laid Aleia's fallen comrades into the earth. With care and respect, he covered each body with soil. When it came to the last of them, he placed their weapon into the ground like a gravestone, marking the sacrifice they had made. He told himself that Aleia's death couldn't be for nothing. Somewhere deep down, he believed this was just the beginning. There were others like the creature he had faced, just like the first one he had met in Sylvia's cave. Whether that demon wanted Sylvie or all of Decathlon, the danger remained the same. It didn't matter if Arthur had 4 elements. His current strength wouldn't be enough. If there truly was a war coming, like the demon had said, then Arthur knew he couldn't afford to be still anymore. If he wanted to protect the people he loved in this world, he had to grow stronger. He cleaned the blood off Aleia's body, using magic to conjure water and freeze it into a thick block of ice. It would preserve her until help could arrive. He found a small flower growing nearby, plucked it, and gently placed it near her. He made a silent promise that she wouldn't be left alone for long. Someone would come for her and for all of them, the ones who now rested below the earth. Suddenly, a loud roar echoed across the cavern walls. Sylvie had returned. Arthur felt her presence before she even appeared. She landed near him, her glowing eyes filled with quiet sadness. She lowered her snout, sensing the grief in him without needing to ask questions. He reassured her, at least on the surface, that he was okay. There was nothing more they could do here. It was time to leave. Sylvie flapped her wings with force, and a gust of wind burst beneath them, lifting them high into the air. As they flew together, Arthur shared everything that had happened since they'd been apart. Sylvie didn't understand the full meaning behind demons or the coming war, but she could sense something terrible was approaching. That alone was enough to leave a weight in both their hearts. When they finally reached the surface, the full moon hung above them in silence. As Arthur expected, no one was there to greet them. The nearest teleportation gate was still hours away on foot, and he needed to move fast. Eventually, he reached the gate. The guard stationed there looked surprised to see a young boy approaching alone at such a late hour. Arthur quickly identified himself. Arthur Lewin of Zyrus Academy, returning from a class trip at Widow's Crypt. The guard's expression changed, clearly realizing that this boy had just come from the place where the terrible incident had occurred. Arthur gave a small nod in confirmation. The guard immediately turned to his partner and ordered him to notify Zyrus Academy and the Adventurers Guild without delay. The second guard rushed off, obeying the command without hesitation. The main guard turned back to Arthur, now concerned for the boy's injuries. He said the Adventurers Guild had been planning a search and rescue operation for him, and he offered to fetch a healing emitter to treat his wounds. But Arthur gently stopped him, placing a firm hand on the guard's arm. His voice was calm but resolute. He didn't want help or attention. He only wanted to return home. He promised he would report everything to Zyrus Academy himself the next day. The guard looked at Arthur for a moment, then sighed and gave in, letting the boy go. A carriage was already waiting. Arthur climbed in without a word and began the ride back home. The journey was quiet, but inside his mind, everything was racing. He wasn't thinking about the mission or the report. He was thinking about the future. For the first time in both of his lives, Arthur felt what it truly meant to protect those he loved. Even when he had once been a king, that feeling had never struck him so deeply. When he reached home, Arthur stood outside, just staring at the door. The lights inside were still on. His family was probably worried sick, waiting for him to come back. But the thought of stepping inside and facing their questions felt too heavy. He sat down on the steps quietly. A long, bitter sigh escaped him. He admitted to himself that maybe he was being selfish, but at that moment, he simply didn't have the strength to talk about what had happened. Aaliyah's final moments echoed in his mind, her voice trembling in fear, her desperate wish not to die alone. Arthur could still feel her in his arms, her breathing growing weaker, the life leaving her. He thought about what she had gone through, and he hoped somehow that she might be given another chance, the same way he had been. While Arthur sat there in silence, the door behind him opened gently. He hadn't even noticed the sound. Reynold, his father, stepped outside. Looking out over the floating city, he spoke about how beautiful the view was. Arthur didn't reply. Reynold sat beside Arthur in silence for a moment. Then gently, he spoke words Arthur didn't realize he needed to hear. He told his son that he didn't need to explain anything. Reynold reminded him that their mother, Alice, could only use her healing magic on minor wounds. Not because she lacked skill, but because she too carried deep scars that no magic could touch. Scars not on her body, but in her heart. Just like Arthur now, she once felt pain that was too heavy to speak about. Reynold didn't pressure Arthur. Instead, he acknowledged that everyone fights their own battles in life. Battles that can't be shared or understood by others. Not fully. With a father's warmth, Reynold gently ran his hand through Arthur's hair. He assured him that, like he did for Alice, he would be there. Always. He would wait for his son to come out stronger, come out victorious. He reminded Arthur that life isn't just one fight. It's a series of battles. Losing one doesn't mean failure. It only means you get back up, learn from it, and move forward. Arthur's eyes filled with tears, the weight of grief and guilt overwhelming him. But Reynold's words gave him something solid to hold on to. That night became one of the hardest Arthur had ever faced, not as a king from another life, nor as a warrior, but as a boy, grieving and lost. It was a night that would forever be etched into his memory. The next morning, Arthur made his way to Zyrus Academy, but before heading inside, he made a stop at a high platform near Director Cynthia Goodsky's office. Standing alone, he held the identification tag of Aaliyah Triskin. He stared out at the view, letting the breeze hit his face. The weight of what he carried pressed heavily on his chest. Cynthia arrived shortly after. She had expected Arthur to visit her directly, but found him there instead. She noticed that his bond, Sylvie, wasn't with him. Arthur had asked Sylvie to stay home. Cynthia thought it was a good call. After what had happened during the class trip, some rest was necessary. She asked if Arthur had any plans. He mentioned he'd promised to go shopping later with his mother and sister, but Cynthia's expression grew serious. She brought up the anomaly with the Queen Snarlers, something Professor Glory had already briefed her about. She asked Arthur if there had been anything else. In response, Arthur handed her Alea's identification tag. Cynthia froze as she looked down at it. Her face turned pale. The name confirmed what she feared. She couldn't believe it. Aaliyah Triskin, a lance, was gone. Cynthia stammered as she tried to confirm if it was really true. Arthur quietly confirmed it. Alea and her team still lay at the bottom of widow's crypt lifeless. Cynthia's mind raced. For a Lance to be killed, it wasn't normal. This wasn't something that could happen by chance. Whoever was responsible had to be powerful, more powerful than anything they had faced so far. Cynthia knew what this meant, the enemy. Whoever they were, they had already made their move. Still shaken, she asked Arthur if he had seen what caused it. Arthur hesitated for a long moment and then simply said no. Cynthia didn't push further. She said she would inform the council immediately. What had happened was too big, too dangerous, and Arthur had already done enough. She told him not to carry this burden any longer. The council and the remaining Lances would take care of it. Arthur only hoped that would be enough. The next day, Arthur kept his promise to his family and joined his mother and his younger sister for a shopping trip. Even though his mind was burdened with responsibilities, he chose to set them aside for now. Spending time with his loved ones, especially his mother and sister, was something he wouldn't trade, not even for the weight of duty pressing on him. They moved from one shop to another, the number soon slipping from Arthur's count. Ellie, full of energy, darted ahead excitedly while Alice followed with a patient smile. They eventually entered another clothing store, one that Tabitha seemed especially fond of. Her enthusiasm was impossible to ignore. She was clearly in her element, surrounded by racks of clothes and new arrivals. Arthur, however, had other things on his mind. While his family admired different outfits, he tried to politely shift the focus. He was looking for training supplies, specifically elixirs. When he asked, Tabitha mentioned there was a well-known shop just around the corner that sold exactly what he was looking for. Before Alice could offer to accompany him, Ellie excitedly wrapped a muffler around Sylvie's neck, showing it off with childlike glee. Sylvie, however, looked less thrilled, her expression pleading silently for help. Arthur set down the bags he had been carrying, smiled, and reassured them that he would go alone. He told them to enjoy their time and promised to catch up later. Then, with a final glance at Sylvie, whose little paw reached out toward him as if begging not to be left behind, Arthur turned and left. He silently thanked her for her sacrifice. As Arthur stepped out onto the busy street, he scanned the area for the elixir shop Tabitha had mentioned. Eventually, he spotted a small, run-down place with a crooked sign that hung loosely from a single nail. The wooden board looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Arthur had to tilt his head just to read the faded letters. The shop looked more like a place that would sell poisons rather than potions. Arthur had barely turned away from the crooked signboard of the potion shop when a frail voice caught him off guard. Beside him, seated on the cold ground, was an old man, his hand stretched out, palm open, asking for spare change. Arthur, still distracted from the odd appearance of the shop, reached into his pocket and offered a coin without much thought. As the old man took it, his wrinkled hands moved with a speed that didn't match his fragile look. It took Arthur a second to realize what he had just done. He'd handed over a silver coin by mistake. That was worth 100 copper coins. Startled, Arthur quickly dug back into his pocket, this time making sure to hold a proper copper coin. But when he looked up to hand it over, the old man had vanished without a trace. Arthur stood there, stunned, his mind racing with confusion. It was the third strange thing to happen to him in just a few minutes. With a sigh of defeat, Arthur turned back to the task at hand and stepped toward the weathered door of the potion shop. The wooden frame looked brittle, almost ready to collapse. As he reached for the copper doorknob, a strange pulse of mana caught his attention. It was faint, but definitely there. When the door clicked open, a foul stench rushed out, so strong that Arthur began to cough uncontrollably. It smelled like a mix of rotting herbs and something much worse. A familiar voice greeted him from inside. Arthur stepped in, only to see the same old man from earlier slouched behind a fragile counter. It was the beggar. Arthur was stunned. The man had tricked him, yet here he was, calm and unfazed. He offered Arthur a deal, to pick any item from the store as repayment for the silver coin. Arthur looked around, doubtful anything here was worth that much. Despite his thoughts, Arthur reminded himself to stay respectful. The old man's shop looked more like a forgotten attic. Dust clung to every corner, shelves sagged under the weight of strange unlabeled bottles, and the air smelled of mildew and old magic. Still, curiosity pulled Arthur in deeper. He wondered how old this place truly was, and whether it had ever been cleaned. The old man, content in the middle of the chaos, simply waved off the idea of cleaning as something unfit for someone of his age. Arthur carefully made his way past half-open boxes that cluttered the shop's narrow path. He walked deeper into the strange store. As he scanned them, a sudden movement caught his eye from above. Perched on the top shelf was a cat. Its fur was almost pitch black, but it was the eyes that held Arthur's attention. They weren't ordinary. They seemed to shimmer with depth, like they held stars inside them. That stare pulled him in for a moment before he shook it off and returned to examining the items on the shelves. Among them, Arthur noticed a small black box, plain and quiet, no markings. It was about the size of a jewelry box. Curious, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a ring, and its gemstones sparkled strangely. As he lifted it closer to inspect, the gem suddenly squirted a stream of liquid at his face. Arthur reacted in a flash, tilting his head just in time to dodge the shot. The liquid splattered behind him. Arthur, startled, demanded to know what it was. The old man answered calmly, it was just water. At that point, Arthur truly began to wonder if staying any longer would drive him mad. Then Then, out of nowhere, a white blur dashed into the store through the open door. It landed on his head with perfect aim. It was Sylvie. She scolded Arthur with a tiny paw for leaving her behind. He smiled and rubbed her head in return, relieved to see her safe. As Arthur turned back, ready to declare that he hadn't found anything useful, he paused. The old man now looked pale, his expression frozen like he'd just seen a ghost. Arthur asked if he was okay. The man simply coughed and nodded, saying he was fine, though his voice trembled. Arthur gave one final look around the messy shop and admitted he couldn't find anything worth taking. He asked if the old man could just return the silver coin instead, but the old man ignored the complaint. He stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward a shelf near the front of the store. Without a glance, he picked out something and tossed it back toward Arthur. Arthur caught it, a small ball about the size of a marble. He looked at it suspiciously, holding it cautiously in case it too had any tricks. The old man simply told him it was something he would need, then waved him away. The game was over. Arthur sighed and stepped out of the bizarre shop. As he walked through the narrow alley, he noticed the black cat once again. It stared at him, then at Sylvie, before casually turning away like it had lost interest. He reached the end of the alley where his family was waiting. His mother, Alice, and younger sister Ellie were seated at a table with Tabitha. Ellie waved excitedly with a drink in her hand, and Alice asked if he had found what he was looking for. Arthur hesitated. He wasn't sure how to answer. Tabitha, calm as ever, mentioned that the shop was well known for its rare elixirs and training supplies. In fact, it was usually packed with students hoping to get their hands on something useful. Arthur, confused, questioned how such a shabby place could be so popular. When they turned the corner, Tabitha raised her hand and pointed toward the shop. Arthur followed her gesture, expecting to see the same rundown alleyway he had been in earlier. Instead, he froze. His mouth hung open in shock, and the bag slipped from his hands. The narrow, worn path and broken shelves were gone. In their place was a clean, polished marble road that led to a grand three-story building. The building stood tall and proud, with shining walls and elegant windows. A bright golden sign above the entrance read, Zyrus Elixirs. Arthur could hardly believe it. Just moments ago, he had been wandering through what looked like an old shack, dodging strange liquids and dealing with a suspicious old man. But now, standing before him was something that looked more like a high-class academy than a store. Far away from the peaceful walls of Zyrus Academy, Lucas Wykes walked through a dim, silent tunnel. The path was narrow and damp, lit only by faint, flickering torches. Leading him was Charles. Eventually, they reached a single door. Without a word, Charles opened it, and both stepped inside. Lucas glanced around the hidden chamber, unimpressed. Around the edges of the room stood dozens of cloaked individuals, their faces hidden in shadow. At the center, on a raised platform, sat a man on a throne, his face covered by a mask. Lucas sneered at the place and shoved his foot into Charles, clearly annoyed by what he saw. He had expected something grand, but to him, it looked like a joke. The masked man, calm and composed, spoke from his throne, greeting Lucas and calling the gathering one of his many meetings. The quiet room seemed to revolve around this man. Charles respectfully introduced Lucas, saying he had brought him as requested. The masked man responded smoothly, addressing Lucas by name and calling him famous. Lucas wasn't interested in flattery. He smirked, making it clear that he hadn't come to join anything. He had simply followed Charles out of curiosity. His tone was mocking, questioning who the masked man even was. The idea that this person might be a professor only made him laugh harder. The tension in the room rose quickly. One of the cloaked figures shouted at Lucas, calling him a mutt and demanding he show respect. The insult hit hard. Lucas didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes was cold and sharp. Then, without warning, the masked man snapped his fingers. In an instant, the one who had insulted Lucas was engulfed in flames. The scream that followed echoed through the chamber, filled with panic and pain. The man begged for mercy, his body shaking as fire consumed him, but no help came. The masked figure remained still on his throne, speaking with calm authority, reminding everyone that disrespect, especially toward their new guest, would not be tolerated. Lucas observed everything carefully. Inwardly, he admitted he might have done the same thing in that situation, but what struck him most was that he couldn't sense any mana from the masked figure. That made him uneasy. Turning his attention back to the matter at hand, Lucas demanded more information. He wanted to know what this group was truly trying to accomplish and why they needed him. He also questioned if they were the same people responsible for drugging students. The masked man didn't deny it, but said they had bigger goals, plans that went far beyond the academy. The masked man explained that while he was currently unable to act openly, he needed powerful mages to execute certain operations on his behalf. Lucas fit that requirement. He then revealed that everyone in the group was a dissatisfied noble, humans who once believed in the idea that Zyrus Academy existed to preserve bloodlines and noble pride. Lucas might have been different from them, but the masked figure pointed out how corrupted the academy's motto, students, and structure structure had become. He asked Lucas if that didn't bother him too. Lucas dismissed the idea of wasting his power on people he considered beneath him. The students, the adventurers, even the nobles. They were all trash in his eyes. He had no interest in lowering himself to follow someone else's orders. As he turned to leave, the masked man struck a nerve. He brought up Arthur Lewin. That single name caused Lucas to stop in his tracks. The masked man pressed further, mocking Lucas for losing to Arthur, pointing out that Arthur hadn't even tried during their encounter. Lucas clenched his fists in rage. The words stung deeply, and it was clear he hadn't fully recovered from that humiliation. The masked man rose from his throne at last, declaring himself a benefactor, someone who only sought the betterment of the continent. He reminded Lucas again that what he was offering was mutual gain. Lucas didn't respond right away, but inside his thoughts churned. He wondered how long this man had been watching him. Finally, Lucas gave in, asking him to continue. The masked man's tone shifted, confident, as if everything was already in motion. He revealed that soon he would be able to move freely, and when that happened, the fragile peace between the humans, elves, and dwarves would fall apart completely. He claimed the council and even the academy's director were already being dealt with, leaving the path open for chaos. And in that chaos, he wanted Lucas Wykes to clean up the remaining loose ends. Lucas understood immediately. Arthur Lewin, he had to be one of those loose ends. It was obvious. And when Lucas asked, the masked man confirmed it, even mocking him by pointing out that Lucas's mixed blood hadn't dulled his intellect. But Lucas wasn't a fool. He knew Arthur's strength, especially now that he had realized Arthur had never been fighting seriously during their encounters. Killing someone like Arthur Lewin wasn't something to take lightly. Lucas demanded to know if the masked man expected him to take the same mysterious drug that had turned Marcos into a monster. The masked man dismissed Marcos as weak. According to him, Lucas wouldn't need to worry if he was truly as powerful as he believed. The powers that would be granted to him would be different, something far beyond what others had received, something far more dangerous. Still, Lucas was no puppet. If he was going to fight Arthur, it had to be a real battle, one that would force Arthur to go all out. Otherwise, it would be pointless. The masked man had already thought of that too. He said that Arthur, despite all his power, was still human, and like any human, he had attachments. His friends, his family, but more than anyone else, one person held special meaning. Lucas's lips curled into a grin as he said the name himself, Tessia Erlith. The masked man nodded with pleasure. Tessia, a full-blooded elf, acting as the face of the student council in a school supposedly meant for human nobles. It was unacceptable to the group gathered there. The followers of the masked man erupted into disgusted agreement, shouting against the idea of another elf in a position of leadership. The masked man leaned in, painting the scene clearly. A single drop of Tessia's blood, spilled in the right moment, would be enough. Enough to drive Arthur mad, enough to force him to unleash everything. Lucas, amused by the cruelty of the plan, chuckled darkly. He saw the path ahead, and now it was lined with fire. His smirk returned, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he gave in completely. He was ready. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching.